The air in the long stone corridor was colder than it should have been. A deep cellar-chilled draft that snaked around the tapestries and stole the warmth from Astrid's skin. For months she had lived on the stories she told herself. Stories of a burdened king, a dedicated alpha, a mate lost to the endless demands of his council. The bond, that silver thread that was supposed to bind their souls, had grown thin and quiet, a distant hum where a symphony once played. She'd blamed the strain of his duties, the weight of the crown. It was easier than admitting the truth that shivered in her marrow. The silence was not from his fatigue, but from his neglect. Tonight his scent, pine and winter ozone, the scent of the wild mountains he ruled, had led her away from their shared chambers. Not towards the grand council hall, but deeper into the disused guest wing, a place of dust and ghosts. The scent was a living trail, and she had followed it like a wolf on the hunt. Her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest, and now she stood before a half-opened door. The light from within spilling a pale, honeyed rectangle onto the flagstones. Inside he was not alone. Alpha King Havard Grimthorn, her mate, was with another. Scene called an Omega from a subservient pack, her hair a fall of molten gold against the white linen sheets. They were not locked in a frantic, guilty embrace. The scene was worse, so much worse. It was calm, practiced. His hand rested on the curve of her hip, his thumbs stroking lazy circles, his head pillowed on her chest. Their scents were tangled together, his sharp pine softened by her sweet cloying fragrance of honeyed milk. It was a perfume of domesticity, of long shared hours and unapologetic intimacy. Astrid did not gasp. She did not make a sound. The instinct to scream, to tear the world apart with the rage of a wronged mate was absent. In its place was a vast, echoing stillness. The silver thread of their bond in her chest did not snap with a searing pain. It simply withdrew. It coiled back into itself, leaving a void that was not agonizing, but numb, cold. An amputation of the soul performed so cleanly she felt only the phantom ache of where it used to be. In that absolute terrifying quiet, she finally understood the meetings had been real. They had just never been about leadership. She turned before either of them could see her, her movements unnaturally silent. She drifted back through the corridors, a ghost in her own home, the chill of the stones seeping into her bones. Her feet carried her to their chambers. His chambers, she corrected herself internally. The vast room was dominated by a hearth of carved obsidian and a bed draped in heavy furs. His scent was everywhere, a constant suffocating reminder of what she had lost, of what she had never truly had. She stood in the center of the room, looking at the life she had tried so hard to build. The books she'd left by his side of the bed, the silver comb she used to brush his dark hair after he returned from a hunt, the delicate porcelain vase holding wilted winter roses, a gesture he had long since stopped noticing. Each object was a monument to a lie. The heavy oak door creaked open behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. His presence was a pressure change in the air, a drop in temperature. The bond, what was left of it, gave a faint phantom twitch, a muscle memory of connection. Astrid. His voice was low, devoid of alarm or guilt. It held only a faint, weary annoyance, as if she were a minor inconvenience at the end of a long day. She turned slowly. Havard stood there, magnificent and cruel in his power. He had pulled on his breeches, his broad chest bare, the intricate tattoos of his lineage stark against his skin. His dark hair was tousled and the scent of scene clung to him like a second skin. He did not look like a man caught in betrayal. He looked like a king who had been disturbed. "You should not have followed me," he said, his jaw tight. It was not an apology. It was a command. Astrid found her voice, though it felt like a stranger's, thin and brittle. "The council meetings run late." His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, narrowed. He took a step into the room, his power rolling off him in palpable waves, meant to intimidate to silence. "Do not play the fool, it doesn't suit you." "What does?" she whispered, the words barely audible. "The beautiful barren mate, the quiet queen who warms your bed when your duties elsewhere are fulfilled." A flicker of anger crossed his face. "Scene is a necessity. The pack needs an heir, Astrid. The bloodline must continue, something you have been unable to provide." The words were stones, each one striking her with brutal precision. They had tried for 2 years, 2 years of hollow hopes and monthly mornings, of healers shaking their heads and whispering about blighted wombs. He had made her feel like a failure, a broken vessel. Now she saw it was not a shared sorrow, but a convenient excuse. "So you sought a solution," she said, the numbness in her chest protecting her from the full force of the blow. I did what was necessary for the continuation of my line, for the strength of this pack, he stated as if discussing crop rotations or border patrols. This changes nothing between us. You are the queen. That is your place. Place, a title, a position, a gilded cage where she was expected to sit silently and watch him build a life with another woman. She looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time in months. The man she had loved, the alpha she had bound herself to, was gone. In his place stood a stranger, a king who saw her not as his other half, but as a political asset with a single glaring flaw. No, she said, the word a small, solid thing in the cavernous room. Havard's brows drew together. No, that is not my place. She walked towards the large wardrobe, her movements deliberate. She pulled open the heavy doors, revealing gowns of velvet and silk, cloaks trimmed with fur, jewels that glittered like captive stars, the uniform of a queen. She ignored them all, reaching instead for the simple woolen traveling cloak tucked in the back, the one she'd worn when she first arrived here as a hopeful bride. He watched her, a mixture of disbelief and irritation on his face. "What are you doing?" "Withdrawing," she said, fastening the cloak at her throat. The rough wool was a comfort against her skin, just like the bond had once been. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, the first genuine crack in his composure. He could feel it then, the silence where her presence used to be, the cold void where her love had once warmed him. "You cannot leave," he said, his voice dropping into the low, commanding growl of an alpha. It was a sound that made lesser wolves cower, a vibration that shook the very bones. "You are my mate. You are bound to me, to this pack." Astrid met his gaze, and for the first time she felt no answering submission, no instinct to yield. The numb space in her chest was a shield. "The bond is a thread, Havard, not a chain. It requires two to hold it. You let go of your end long ago." She walked past him, heading for the door. He reached out, his hand clamping down on her arm, his grip like iron. The touch sent no spark, no warmth, only a jarring sense of violation. "Think of the scandal," he hissed, his face close to hers. "The weakness it will show, an alpha king whose own mate abandons him. I will not allow it." "You allowed Scene into your bed," she replied, her voice remaining impossibly calm. "You allowed your pack to believe I was a failure. You have already shown them your weakness. It is your honor that is stained, not mine." With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she pulled her arm from his grasp. She did not look back as she walked out of the chamber, leaving him standing amidst the opulent symbols of their shared life. She walked through the silent palace, her soft boots making no sound on the stone. The guards at the main gate watched her pass, their faces impassive, assuming their queen was taking a late-night walk. None dared to stop her. The cold night air was a shock, but a welcome one. It was clean, sharp, and free of the suffocating scent of betrayal. The moon was a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky, offering little light. She headed not for the road, but for the trees, for the ancient, brooding forest that bordered the kingdom to the north, the Thornwood, a place of superstition and fear, rumored to be home to exiles, rogues, and things far older and wilder than their pack. She reached the edge of the territory, the line marked by ancient carved stones that hummed with faint ancestral magic. This was the border of her world, the end of everything she had ever known. To step past it was to become packless, an exile, a lone wolf, a fate often worse than death. She paused, her hand resting on the cold, moss-covered stone. She could hear the pack now. A great howl rising from the valley below, led by the powerful, familiar voice of her mate. It was the call for unity, the sound that had once made her heart swell with belonging. Tonight it sounded like the bars of a cage slamming shut. It was not a call home. It was a demand for her return, a threat. A frigid wind swept down from the northern peaks, cutting through her cloak. It carried a scent she had never encountered before, not of pine or earth, but of something else entirely. It was the scent of deep winter, of cold iron, of ancient stone, and something primal, something fiercely, dangerously alive. It was a scent that did not belong to Havard's world. It was a scent of beasts and kings who were one and the same, of a power that was raw and untamed. It terrified her. Yet deep within the hollow space in her chest, something stirred. A flicker of resonance, a strange, inexplicable pull toward the very danger everyone had always warned her against. The howl behind her rose in pitch, now laced with anger and command. Havard was hunting her. Astrid took a deep breath of the iron-edged air, the cold burning her lungs. She looked back one last time at the glittering lights of the palace, a beautiful hollow shell. Then she turned her face to the darkness, to the terrifying and unknown scent on the wind, and took a step across the border. The moment Astrid crossed the threshold of the Thornwood, the world changed. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth and centuries of decay. The trees were different here, ancient gnarled oaks and black-barked pines that grew too close together, their branches twisted like the arthritic fingers of old men clawing at her cloak and snagging in her hair. The familiar sounds of the night, the chirr of crickets, the distant call of a nightjar, fell away into an oppressive, watchful silence. It was a silence that listened. Behind her, the howls of Havard's pack warriors echoed sharp and clear in the cold air. They were hunting, not searching for a lost queen, but hunting a fugitive. The distinction was a blade twisting in the hollow space where her bond had been. The bond, its absence, was a physical malady. Her senses, usually sharp enough to pick out the rustle of a mouse in the undergrowth 100 yards away, were muted and dull. The world felt muffled, seen through a pane of frosted glass. Her inner wolf, the primal core of her being, was a silent, shivering ghost within her, cut off from the pack, from her alpha, from the very magic that made her who she was. She was less than a whole person, a shadow of a shifter. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of her numbness. This was a fool's choice. She had traded a gilded cage for a certain death. To be packless was to be nothing, and to be a packless omega in the Thornwood was a death sentence whispered in nurseries to frighten unruly pups. She stumbled over a gnarled root, her ankle twisting painfully. She caught herself on the rough bark of a pine, splinters digging into her palm. Her breath came in ragged, burning gasps. "Faster!" she whispered to herself, the sound swallowed by the suffocating quiet. Havard's scent, pine and fury, was a poison on the wind, growing stronger. He was closing the distance. He was a king, an alpha of alphas, his strength and speed legendary. She was an omega, her stamina no match for his, especially now, weakened and cut adrift. She pictured him running, not as the mate who had once whispered promises against her skin, but as a predator, his powerful form moving effortlessly through the darkness, his eyes fixed on his quarry. On her, she pushed herself onward, deeper into the suffocating woods. The ground sloped downward, becoming slick with damp moss and loose scree. She slid more than she ran, grabbing at ferns and saplings to slow her descent. The howls behind her grew more frantic, edged with the frustration she recognized. They were nearing the heart of the forest, the territory where even the boldest warriors of her old pack would not tread. Then the air shifted again. The temperature plummeted, a sudden unnatural drop that left frost crystallizing on her cloak. And the scent, that strange, terrifying scent from the border, returned 100 times stronger. It was the smell of a winter that never ended, of forged iron cooled in snow, of blood spilled on ancient stone. It was a scent of raw, untamed power so potent it made the air taste metallic. It saturated everything, eclipsing Havard's familiar pine, scrubbing his presence from the world. And with the arrival of that scent, the sounds of pursuit stopped. Abruptly. Astrid scrambled behind a massive fallen log, her heart hammering against her ribs. She strained her ears, listening. There was nothing. No snapping twigs, no heavy panting, no angry howls. The pack warriors had halted. She could just faintly catch their scent, a confusing mix of fury, duty, and something else. A deep instinctual fear. They were at an invisible line, unwilling or unable to cross. Their alpha's command to retrieve her was at war with a more primal terror, and terror was winning. She realized with a jolt that she had not escaped Havard. She had simply run from his territory into another's. Slowly she pushed herself to her feet. The woods here were even darker, the canopy so thick that the sliver of moon was completely obscured. She was in a new kingdom now, ruled by the beast whose scent clung to every leaf and stone. She moved forward, her earlier panic replaced by a chilling sense of dread. The silence was absolute. No animal life stirred. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. She broke through a final line of skeletal thorn bushes and stumbled into a clearing. It was a perfect circle, unnaturally so. In the center stood a single colossal oak tree, lightning blasted and dead, its bare branches reaching for the sky like blackened bones. The ground was not covered in soil or moss, but in a fine silvery white ash that seemed to shimmer with a faint internal light. It swirled around her ankles like disturbed snow, cold to the touch. This was the heart of the scent, the source of the power. It radiated from the dead tree, from the ashen ground, a palpable force that pressed in on her from all sides. It felt ancient, sorrowful, and laced with a rage so profound it seemed to have frozen the very air. She stood in the center of the clearing, turning in a slow circle. She was trapped. Behind her were Havard's hunters, waiting for her to be driven back out. Before her was this, the lair of whatever creature was feared so deeply that an Alpha King's command held no sway. Exhaustion, bone deep and final, washed over her. Her legs trembled, no longer able to support her. The adrenaline that had fueled her flight was gone, leaving behind only the biting cold and the gnawing ache of her twisted ankle. She had run as far as she could. There was nowhere left to go. She sank to her knees in the cold, soft ash. It was over. Let Havard's warriors come. Let the beast of the Thornwood find her. The fight had gone out of her, leaving only the vast, echoing void in her soul. She curled into a ball, pulling her woolen cloak tightly around her, a futile gesture against the soul-deep chill. Her eyelids felt heavy as lead. The world began to blur at the edges, the ominous skeletal tree dissolving into a smudge of black against a gray sky. Just as consciousness began to slip away, a shadow fell over her. It was vast, blotting out what little light filtered through the canopy. It hadn't approached. It had simply appeared. The scent of winter and iron became overwhelming, a physical presence that stole the air from her lungs. She tried to lift her head to see the face of her doom, but her muscles would not obey. Through her lashes, she saw a pair of immense fur-clad boots planted in the ash beside her. She felt the weight of a gaze on her, heavy and intense, a gaze that seemed to peel back the layers of her skin and looked directly at the broken thing cowering in her soul. A low sound rumbled from the shadow's chest, not a growl of aggression, but something deeper, more complex. A sound of profound, weary recognition. Then a large hand, calloused and impossibly warm, gently touched her shoulder. The contact was a shock, a spark of heat against her frozen skin. It was not the touch of a monster. It was careful, almost reverent. Her last coherent thought before the darkness claimed her completely was of the impossible paradox of this creature. He smelled of eternal winter, yet he felt like the first embers of a dying fire. Strong arms slid beneath her, lifting her from the cold ash as if she weighed nothing at all, and she surrendered to the black, silent tide. Astrid drifted back to consciousness slowly, as if surfacing from a deep frozen lake. The first thing she registered was warmth, a profound, penetrating warmth that seeped into her bones, chasing away the marrow-deep chill of the ashen clearing. She was lying on something soft, layers of thick, heavy furs that smelled of cedar, smoke, and the clean scent of the wild. A fire crackled nearby, its gentle popping a comforting counterpoint to the howling wind outside. Her eyes fluttered open. She was in a cave, not a damp, miserable hole in the rock, but a vast, dry cavern. The walls rose high into the darkness, but the space around her was an island of light and warmth, carved out by a large, well-tended fire pit. The air was rich with the scent of roasting meat and brewing herbs, a comforting aroma that made her empty stomach clench with a painful, forgotten hunger. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, and a sharp throb of pain from her ankle made her gasp. She looked down. Her foot was bare, her boot and stocking gone. Her ankle, swollen and bruised a dark purple, was wrapped in a clean bandage of linen, smeared with a fragrant dark green poultice that seemed to hum with a gentle heat of its own. Do not move. The bones are not broken, but the ligaments are torn. Voice came from the shadows beyond the firelight. It was deep, a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very stone of the cave. It was the same resonant rumble she had heard in the clearing, a voice that held the gravitas of mountains and the weariness of ages. She turned her head, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drum beat against her ribs. He stepped into the light. He was immense, larger than any shifter she had ever seen, Havard included. His shoulders were broad enough to block out half the fire light, his frame thick with the dense, powerful muscle of a true alpha predator. He was bare-chested, his skin etched with a roadmap of old scars, pale silvery lines that spoke of countless battles. One particularly vicious scar ran from his left temple down across his eye and disappeared into the thick, dark beard that covered his jaw. The eye itself was clouded, a milky white orb that stared into nothing, giving his face a stark, brutal asymmetry. His other eye, a startling, piercing gray, watched her with an unnerving intensity. His dark hair was long and unkempt, threaded with streaks of gray and held back from his face by a simple leather cord. He wore rugged breeches of dark hide and thick fur-lined boots, the same she had seen in the clearing. He was the beast of the Thornwood, the source of the scent of winter and iron, and he was watching her as if he were trying to read the last pages of a book he already knew by heart. "Who are you?" Astrid's voice was a dry rasp. He moved from the shadows to the fire, stoking it with a piece of iron. The fire light played across his scarred features, making him look like a warrior king carved from granite. "I am called Ulfric," he said, his gaze not leaving the flames, "and this is my territory. You are a trespasser." The words were a simple statement of fact, devoid of the overt threat she might have expected. Still, a shiver of fear traced its way down her spine. "My apologies," she whispered. "I was fleeing." "I know what you were fleeing." He finally looked at her, his good eye pinning her in place. "The whelp King Grimthorn and his pack of yapping hounds. Their stink has been tainting my borders for hours. They are still there, waiting." The casual disdain in his voice was startling. He spoke of Alpha King Havard as if he were a minor nuisance. "They are waiting for me," she clarified, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. "Then wait," Ulfric grumbled, turning his attention to a small pot simmering over the flames. He ladled a thick, fragrant broth into a wooden bowl. "The cold will claim them before their courage returns." He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides and knelt beside the bed of furs where she lay. He was even larger up close, a mountain of a man who smelled powerfully of the wild, pine, cold stone and that underlying scent of iron. He held the bowl out to her. "Eat," he commanded. It was not a suggestion. Her hands trembled as she took the bowl. The warmth of the wood seeped into her frigid fingers. The broth was rich with meat and wild vegetables, and the steam carried the scent of healing herbs. She took a tentative sip. The warmth spread through her chest, a stark contrast to the hollow cold that had taken up residence there. She drank more, the simple act of nourishment feeling like a resurrection. Ulfric watched her, his expression unreadable. He did not speak again until she had drained the last of the broth, the warmth and sustenance starting to clear the fog from her mind. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice a little stronger. "You could have left me in the clearing. You could have given me to them." "Havard Grimthorn's mate is of no concern to me," he said, his tone flat. "But a lone she-wolf freezing to death in my heartwood, that is an imbalance, an offense to the old ways." The old ways. The term was archaic, something whispered by the pack elders when they spoke of the time before organized territories and crowned alpha kings. "He has forgotten them," Ulfric said, his gaze turning distant, as if looking through the cave walls and back through time. "His father forgot them before him. They build their stone palaces and call themselves kings, but they have forgotten the pack. They have forgotten the scent of the earth, the language of the moon. They have forgotten what it is to be wolf." His good eye fixed on her again, sharp and appraising. "He broke his bond to you. I can feel the emptiness in you. It is a wound that festers." Astrid flinched instinctively, wrapping her arms around her middle as if to shield the raw, hollow place he had identified so easily. "How can you know that? This forest, it feels everything. Every broken branch, every life given and taken. A broken mate bond is a scream that echoes here for a long, long time." He rose to his full intimidating height and walked back to the fire. "You are an Omega, but you carry no scent of your own. Your wolf is silent." It was true. The absence of the bond had muted her, not just in her senses, but in her very essence. Omegas had a distinct scent, a sign of their nature, meant to soothe and nurture the pack. Hers was gone, scrubbed away, leaving her scentless and blank. It was another layer of her humiliation, of her failure. "Havard said I was barren," she confessed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "He took another to sire an heir," let out a short, harsh sound that might have been a laugh if it held any humor. "He is a fool. He looks for fault in the soil when the seed itself is rotten." He turned from the fire, his expression grim. "He is not strong enough to rule these mountains. His bloodline thins with every generation. They grow soft within their castle walls. They seek alliances of coin and land instead of bonds of blood and spirit." He gestured vaguely towards the cave entrance, towards the world outside. "A hard winter is coming, she-wolf, not just of snow and ice. A darkness stirs in the deep woods. Old things are waking, and he is not ready. His pack is weak, built on politics, not power." Astrid stared at him, trying to comprehend the scale of his words. He spoke of kings and territories, of ancient darkness and the fate of the mountain packs with an authority that was absolute. He was no simple rogue hiding in the woods. "You are an alpha," she stated, the realization dawning on her. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "I am of the Thornwood, the last of my line, an alpha without a pack, a king without a kingdom." He was an exile just like her. But where she felt only weakness and fear, he radiated a power that was elemental, a strength that came not from titles or followers but from the land itself. He was as much a part of this ancient brooding forest as the gnarled trees and the cold stone. "Your pack?" she asked softly. A flicker of something, a deep, profound pain crossed his scarred face, so fleeting she almost missed it. "Gone," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "Lost to the sickness, to the curse that haunts this place." He looked down at his own scarred hands. "It is why I remain, a warden in my own prison. I keep the darkness contained." Ashen clearing, the unnatural cold, the listening silence. It was all beginning to make a terrible kind of sense. The forest wasn't just his territory. It was his charge, his burden. He seemed to shake himself from his dark thoughts, his attention returning to her. "You will rest here, heal. When you are strong enough to travel, you may leave." Leave. The word was hollow. To where? "I am packless, branded. Havard will not let me go, not while I live. It is a stain on his honor." "Honor is a house of cards," Ulfric scoffed. "But you are right. He will hunt you." He looked at her then, a long, searching look. His gaze traveled from her face to the hollow space in her chest he seemed to see so clearly. "A mate bond, even one broken by a fool, leaves an echo, a tether. He will always be able to feel which way you run." The thought was a physical violation, a ghostly chain still connecting her to the man who had betrayed her. She would never be truly free. As if sensing her despair, Ulfric moved closer again. He did not touch her, but his presence was a tangible thing, a shield of warmth against the cold fear. "There are ways to sever such echoes," he said, his voice quiet, almost conspiratorial. "Old ways, but they require a price." Hope, a fragile, dangerous thing, fluttered in her chest. "What price?" He held her gaze, his one good eye seeming to glow with the reflected firelight. "A bond cannot be simply broken. It must be replaced." Implication hung in the air between them, thick and heavy. To sever her tie to Havard, she would have to forge a new one. With him, the scarred, exiled alpha, the lonely king of a dead forest. Her heart hammered, a frantic bird trapped in her ribs. It was an impossible choice, trading one cage for another, trading a known betrayal for an unknown, terrifying future. But as she looked at him, at the raw strength and ancient sorrow in his scarred face, she realized it wasn't a cage he was offering. It was a sanctuary, a dangerous, wild, and uncertain one, but a sanctuary all the same. Here in this cave, with this broken king, she felt more seen than she had in 2 years as Havard's queen. He saw her silence, the conflict in her eyes, and gave a slow nod of understanding. "Rest now, she-wolf. The choice is yours, but know this. As long as you are under my roof in my territory, Grimthorn and his dogs will not touch you. I swear it on the ash of my ancestors." He turned and retreated to the far side of the cavern, settling into the shadows, where he became a large, unmoving silhouette. But she could feel his gaze on her still, a watchful, protective weight. Astrid pulled the heavy furs up to her chin, the scent of cedar and smoke enveloping her. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song, but for the first time since she'd stepped into the Thornwood, she did not feel entirely alone. The choice he had laid before her was a terrifying one, but buried beneath the fear was a flicker of something she had not felt in years, the faintest ember of power, the possibility of a future that was her own. Days bled into one another in the fire-lit twilight of the cavern. Astrid's world shrank to the circle of warmth cast by the flames, the soft nest of furs, and the looming silent presence of the scarred alpha. He was a creature of routine and quiet purpose. He would leave for hours at a time, melting into the shadows of the cave entrance, and return with fresh game, a rabbit, a brace of grouse, or bundles of herbs and roots gathered from the frozen forest floor. He never spoke of where he went, and she never asked. The unspoken truth was that he was patrolling his borders, a lone king guarding his desolate kingdom from the persistent threat of Havard's warriors. She could still feel them sometimes, not with her blunted senses, but as a pressure against the edge of Ulfric's territory, a malevolent patience. Sometimes a lone howl would drift on the wind, a questioning, frustrated sound that made the hairs on her arms stand up. Each time a low growl would rumble in Ulfric's chest, a sound so deep it was more a vibration than a noise, and the howling would cease. He was a living wall between her and her past. In his presence she found a strange rhythm. He would prepare their meals in silence, his large scarred hands surprisingly deft. As he dressed the meat or chopped the roots, she watched the play of firelight across his broad shoulders, the flecks of muscle beneath scarred skin. There was a primal grace to his movements, an economy of motion that spoke of centuries of survival in this harsh wilderness. They would eat on opposite sides of the fire, the crackling flames a conversation between them. But she began to notice things. The way his gaze would linger on her face when he thought she wasn't looking. The careful distance he maintained, as if afraid that coming too close might shatter something fragile between them. The gentleness in his rough hands when he tended to her needs. He showed her how to grind dried herbs with a stone pestle, his large hand closing over hers to guide the motion, the heat of his palm seeping through her skin. He taught her how to stitch a tear in his fur cloak with a needle carved from bone, sitting close beside her, his breath stirring her hair as he corrected her technique. They were the simple domestic tasks of a shared life, yet they were performed with an undercurrent of awareness, of unspoken questions between them. Her ankle was healing. The swelling had gone down, the dark bruising fatting to a sickly yellow-green. Twice a day, Ulfric would tend to it. He would approach without a word, his massive frame eclipsing the firelight. He would kneel before her, and the sheer scale of him, his raw, untamed power, would make her breath catch in her throat. Then he would gently, carefully unwrap the bandage. His touch was firm, but incredibly precise, his calloused fingers never once jarring the tender flesh. The first time he had done it, she had flinched away, the memory of Havard's iron grip still a phantom pain on her skin. Ulfric had simply paused, his hand hovering over her ankle, his one good eye meeting hers. He had waited, his stillness a question, until she gave a slight trembling nod of assent. He had not touched her again until she was ready. That simple act of respect, of granting her a choice in even that small thing, was a more profound gesture than any jewel Havard had ever given her. And as the days passed, she found herself anticipating these moments. The feel of his hands on her skin, rough but careful. The way his fingers would linger just a moment longer than necessary. The heat that seemed to radiate from him, chasing away not just the chill of the cave, but the cold emptiness inside her. She began to notice other things too. The way his jaw would tighten when she winced in pain. The almost imperceptible softening in his scarred features when she smiled. The way his breathing would change when their eyes met across the fire, becoming deeper, more deliberate, as if he were fighting to maintain control. There was a tension building between them, thick and electric, like the charged air before a lightning strike. It hummed in the silence, in every accidental touch, in every shared glance that lasted a heartbeat too long. Tonight, the wind that screamed around the mouth of the cave was fiercer than usual, carrying the promise of a blizzard. Ulfric had returned an hour ago, his hair and beard dusted with snow, his mood darker and more withdrawn than she had yet seen him. He had dropped a freshly killed doe near the entrance, and had since been sharpening a long, wicked-looking hunting knife by the fire, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel, filling the silence. Astrid watched him, her bowl of warm stew held forgotten in her lap. The offer he had made, the choice lay between them, a tangible weight in the air. A bond cannot be simply broken. It must be replaced. She had thought of nothing else. It was a terrifying prospect to bind herself again so soon after the last bond had been so cruelly betrayed, to tie her fate to this grim, solitary man in his cursed forest. But was it really so terrifying? Or was the terror she felt something else entirely? Not fear of him, but fear of what she felt when she looked at him. Fear of the way her body responded to his nearness, the way her pulse quickened when his voice rumbled through the cavern. Fear of wanting something, someone, again after being so thoroughly broken. What would it mean? She asked, her voice quiet but clear over the sound of the blade and the wind. Ulfric stopped his work, the silence that fell feeling sudden and heavy. He looked at her, his gray eye narrowed in the flickering light. What would what mean? The replacement, the new bond. The words felt clumsy, inadequate. Would I be yours like I was his? A muscle tightened in his jaw. He set the knife and wet stone down on the rock beside him with deliberate care. No, he said, his voice a low growl. You would not be mine. That is the language of men like Grimthorn, of owners. The bond I speak of is older than that. It is not a chain of possession. It is an anchor. He leaned forward slightly, the fire light carving deep shadows into the planes of his face. His echo inside you is a beacon. It allows him to feel you, to hunt you, to obsess over the slight to his pride. A new bond, a stronger one, would overwhelm it. It would ground you, shield you. It would tell him in the only language his wolf will understand that you are no longer his to claim. That you are under the protection of another alpha, my protection. What do you get from this anchoring? She pressed, needing to understand. Why would you tie yourself to a broken, scentless omega? For the first time, she saw a flicker of raw vulnerability in his eye. The fierce alpha king of the Thornwood looked for a moment like a man bearing an unbearable weight. "I am alone," he said, the admission seeming to cost him dearly. "My line ends with me." Magic of this place, the curse that took my pack, it feeds on solitude. It festers in silence. To have another soul anchored here, even one, it would be a stay against the darkness, a light in a long night. He looked away from her into the dancing flames. "It would not be a mate bond in the way you have known. There would be no demands, no expectations. It is a pact, sanctuary for you, solace for me." Stark, painful honesty of his words struck her more deeply than any threat or command could have. He was not offering her a gilded cage, but a shared prison. He was offering to stand between her and her past, and all he asked in return was that he not have to face his future alone. "But what if," she began, then hesitated. Her heart was pounding, her mouth suddenly dry. "What if it becomes more than that? What if the bond? What if we?" His gaze snapped back to hers, and the intensity in his gray eye made her breath stop. "Then it becomes more," he said, his voice rough, raw. "The bond grows with what we feed it. If there is only duty, it remains an anchor. If there is more—" He trailed off, but the way he looked at her, the hunger barely restrained in his expression, finished the sentence for him. The air between them seemed to crackle with possibility. Astrid felt her skin flush hot despite the cold. Her inner wolf, silent for so long, stirred deep within her, lifting its head with interest for the first time since the bond had broken. Ulfric rose and came to her side of the fire. He knelt and began to unwrap the bandage on her ankle as he did every night. His nearness was overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the scent of snow and cold iron that clung to him mixed with something deeper, something primal and masculine that made her wolf whine softly. His movements were as gentle as ever, but tonight there was a new tension in them. As he smoothed a fresh layer of the warm poultice onto her skin, his thumb brushed against the sensitive arch of her foot. A jolt, sharp and unexpected, shot up her leg. It was not pain, it was something else. A flicker of warmth in the cold, hollow void in her chest, a ghost of a sensation. A memory of what it felt like to be connected, her breath hitched. Ulfric froze, his hand still on her foot. He looked up at her, his gray eye wide, searching her face. He had felt it too. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor along the dead thread of her inner world. "Your wolf is not gone," he whispered, his voice rough with a strange emotion. "She is not dead. She is sleeping, wounded, hiding from the pain." He looked into her eyes, and in that moment the fire, light, the cave, the howling wind all faded away. She was looking into his gaze, and it was no longer just the eye of a scarred warrior. It was vast and deep, the color of a winter sky just before the moon rises. It held the sorrow of his lost pack, the crushing weight of his lonely duty, the fierce, untamed power of his spirit. And in its depths she saw a reflection of herself, not the broken, barren queen, but a she-wolf, lost and afraid, but alive, still alive. He saw her, all of her, the shame, the betrayal, the hollowness. And he was not repulsed. He was not judging. His gaze held her steady and sure. It was a gaze that held the moon, the tides, the turning of the ancient world. His hand, still warm on her foot, slowly began to travel upward, not with urgency or demand, but with a question. His calloused palm slid along her calf, his touch both rough and gentle, sending shivers racing through her body. He paused at her knee, his fingers pressing gently into the soft hollow behind it, his eye never leaving hers. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her bones. "Tell me this is not what you want, and I will never touch you like this again." Astrid couldn't speak. Her body was waking up, every nerve ending suddenly alive and singing. She realized with a start that she hadn't been touched with desire, with want in so long. Havard's touch had become perfunctory, mechanical, a duty performed without passion. But this was different. Ulfric wasn't taking. He was offering. He was giving her the choice, the power. And the knowledge of that, the respect inherent in his restraint, made her want him more than any command ever could. Instead of words, she reached out and placed her hand on his face, her fingers tracing the brutal scar that ran from temple to jaw. He sucked in a sharp breath, his eye closing for a moment as if her touch caused him pain. But when he opened it again, she saw it wasn't pain, but longing, fierce and desperate and barely contained. "I don't want you to stop," she whispered. The choice was no longer a choice. It was the only path forward. To remain tied by a ghostly thread to Havard's cruelty was a slow, lingering death. To flee into the unknown world, packless and hunted, was a quick one. But this was a chance, not for a life of ease or happiness, but for a life. A chance to heal, a chance to fight, a chance to feel alive again. "I will do it," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I accept your pact." Ulfric's breath drew in with a sharp hiss, the fierce intensity in his eyes sharpened, his gaze burning into her. The air in the cave grew thick, charged with a sudden, potent energy, as if the ancient stones themselves were holding their breath, waiting. He did not move, his warm, strong hand still on her leg, but she felt as if the entire world had just shifted on its axis. Then, slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward. His face was inches from hers, close enough that she could feel his breath warm against her lips, could see the silver flecks in his gray eye, could smell the wild scent of him mixed with wood smoke and winter. "Once this is done," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there is no going back. The ritual will bind us, not as master and possession, but as equals, as partners. Do you understand?" "I understand," she breathed. "And if the bond grows," he continued, his hand sliding higher up her thigh, his touch searing through the thin fabric of her dress, "if what is between us becomes more than duty, more than survival, you will not regret it. You will not resent me for taking you from the life you knew." "The life I knew was a lie," Astrid said, her own hand moving from his face to the back of his neck, her fingers threading through his long, dark hair. "This, here with you, this is the first real thing I've felt in years." Something broke in him then. The iron control he'd maintained since the moment he'd found her in the ashen clearing finally shattered. With a low growl that was more animal than human, he closed the distance between them. His mouth crashed against hers, not gentle, not tentative, but with a desperate hunger that stole the breath from her lungs. His lips were rough, chapped from the cold and the wind, but they moved against hers with a passion that set her blood on fire. His hand cupped the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair as he deepened the kiss, his tongue sweeping into her mouth to taste her. Astrid moaned against his lips, her body arching into him. She had been kissed before many times, but never like this. Never with this raw, primal intensity. Never with the feeling that she was being consumed and worshipped all at once. Havard's kisses had been possessive, demanding. This was different. This was a claiming, yes, but it was also a surrender. Ulfric was giving himself to her as much as he was taking her. His other hand left her thigh and slid around her waist, pulling her up off the furs and into his lap. She went willingly, her legs wrapping around his waist as he held her against his broad chest. She could feel the heat of him through their clothes, the hard planes of muscle, the thundering of his heart that matched her own frantic rhythm. He broke the kiss, both of them gasping for air, and began to trail his lips down her jaw, her neck, the sensitive hollow of her throat. Each touch sent sparks of pleasure racing through her body. She tilted her head back, giving him access, her fingers digging into his shoulders as he found a particularly sensitive spot just below her ear. "Astrid," he growled against her skin, his voice rough with need. "My she-wolf." Possessiveness in his tone should have frightened her. Should have reminded her of Havard's ownership, his demands. But it didn't. Because underlying that possessiveness was reverence, was wonder. As if he couldn't quite believe she was real, that she was here in his arms, that she had chosen him. She pulled back slightly, her hands framing his scarred face, and looked into his eye. "Ulfric," she said, and she saw him shudder at the sound of his name on her lips. "I want this. I want you. Not because I'm desperate or trapped or broken, but because when I look at you, I see strength. I see honor. I see a male who has suffered and endured and refused to give in to the darkness." She pressed her forehead against his, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "I see someone worthy of being chosen." His arms tightened around her almost painfully, and she felt a tremor run through his large frame. When he spoke, his voice was raw, stripped of all pretense. "I am not a good male, Astrid. I am cursed, haunted. The things I have done, the darkness I carry." "I don't care," she interrupted fiercely. "I don't need a good male. I don't need a perfect alpha. I need someone who sees me. Someone who won't break his promises. Someone who will stand beside me, not over me." "Then you have found him," Ulfric said, and there was a finality to his words, a vow. "For as long as you want me, for as long as you will have me, I am yours." They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, the fire crackling beside them. The wind howled outside, but inside the cave there was warmth, there was safety, there was the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find. Finally, reluctantly, Ulfric pulled back. "The ritual must be done at the peak of the full moon," he said, his voice still rough but more controlled. "It is in 2 nights. It is then that the veil is thin and the old magic is strongest." Astrid simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak. 2 nights in 2 nights she would sever the last ghostly tie to Havard and bind herself to this place. To this man. The thought was a terrifying, exhilarating weight in her stomach. You must be strong, he continued, his eyes fixed on hers. Your body and your spirit, the ritual will demand it. It will hurt, Astrid. The severing of a bond, even a broken one, is agony, and the forging of a new one, it will feel like you are being torn apart and remade. Can bear it, she said, lifting her chin. Have borne worse. His hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing across her lips. I know you can, but I wish I could spare you the pain. Some pain is necessary, she said softly. To burn away the old, to make room for the new. He nodded slowly, then with obvious reluctance, he set her back on the furs. The loss of his warmth, of his touch, was almost physical, but she understood. If they continued, if they allowed the passion between them to ignite fully before the ritual, it might complicate the magic. It might make the severing of Havard's echo more difficult. For the next 2 days, he became her keeper in a way he had not been before. The food he prepared was richer, infused with herbs she did not recognize that sent a deep, strengthening heat through her veins. He brewed teas that were earthy and potent, clearing the last of the fog from her mind and senses. He was no longer just a warden. He was a mentor, preparing his charge for a trial, but the awareness between them never faded. Every accidental touch was electric. Every shared glance across the fire was laden with promise. They were dancing around each other, 2 predators circling, waiting for the right moment to claim what they both so desperately wanted. He also began to speak, not of his past, not of the sorrow that shadowed his features, but of the forest. He spoke of the trees as if they were sentient beings, nomming the black-barked pines, the silent sentinels, and the gnarled oaks, the old fathers. He described the paths of the deer and the hunting grounds of the hawk. He taught her the names of the winter-blooming flowers that grew only in the deepest, most sheltered parts of the woods, their petals the color of ice and blood. He was teaching her the language of his kingdom. He was showing her the soul of the Thornwood, the life that pulsed beneath its cursed silent surface. And as she listened, a strange thing happened. She began to feel it faintly. At the very edge of her perception, she could feel the slow, deep heartbeat of the forest around her. It was a resonance, a thrum of ancient sleeping power. Her own inner wolf, the silent ghost within her, stirred for the first time, not with fear or pain, but with a deep instinctual curiosity. It recognized the heartbeat of the Thornwood. It recognized Ulfric as something primal and true, and slowly, cautiously, it began to wake. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, the blizzard broke. A fragile wintry sun cast long blue shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Ulfric declared her ankle healed enough to walk on with care. Come, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. You must see it before the moon rises. He wrapped her in a heavy fur cloak, the one he often wore, and its weight was a comfort. It carried his scent, winter, iron, and a faint trace of wood smoke, and she found herself breathing it in, a strange, grounding reassurance. She was surrounded by him, claimed by him even before the ritual had begun. He led her from the cave. The world outside was blindingly white, the air so cold it felt sharp in her lungs. The deep snow muffled all sound, creating a world of profound peace. He led her not back towards the ashen clearing, but deeper into the woods, along a path she had not seen. The trees here were even older, their branches heavy with snow, forming a cathedral-like canopy above them. After a short walk, they came to a place that stole her breath. It was a small hidden amphitheater of stone, sheltered by a sheer cliff face on one side. In the center, a hot spring bubbled up from the earth, sending plumes of steam into the frigid air. The water was a startling vivid turquoise, and the rocks around its edge were free of snow, warmed from below. Runes, ancient and weathered, were carved into the stones, symbols of power and binding that she had only ever seen in the oldest pack scrolls. This is the Heartwood, Ulfric said, his voice hushed with reverence. The place of beginnings, the ritual will be performed here. Astrid stared at the steaming pool, at the ancient runes. This was a place of deep magic, older than any Alpha King, older than any pack boundary. It felt sacred, primal. The very air hummed with power. What must I do? Asked, her voice a whisper. You must enter the water, you must let go, he said, turning to face her. His expression was grim, his one good eye filled with a warning. When the bond is forged, it will feel like fire and ice. It will seek out the echo of Grimthorn within you and burn it away. You must not fight it. You must allow it to cleanse you. It will be painful. Her fear returned, a cold knot in her stomach. She thought of Havard, of his betrayal, of the hollow ache that had become a part of her. The echo of him was a poison, and the thought of it being burned away, no matter the cost, was also a kind of hope. "And you?" she asked. "I will be the anchor," he said simply. "I will guide the magic. It will hold you to this place so you are not lost in the pain." They waited as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the snow in shades of rose and violet. The cold deepened and the first stars began to pierce the indigo sky. Ulfric built a small fire near the edge of the spring, and they sat in silence, the weight of what was to come pressing down on them. When the full moon crested the top of the cliffs, huge and luminously white, it bathed the clearing in an ethereal silver light. The steam from the spring glowed. The runes on the stones seemed to pulse with a faint energy, as if the earth itself was awakening. "It is time," Ulfric said. Astrid's hands trembled as she unfastened the heavy cloak and let it fall to the snow. She was dressed in a simple linen shift she had worn beneath her traveling clothes. The cold air was a shock against her skin, raising goosebumps along her arms, but she forced herself to walk to the edge of the pool. The steam billowed around her, warm and inviting, smelling of minerals and ancient earth. She looked back at Ulfric. He stood like a statue in the moonlight, his scarred face a mask of intense concentration. But beneath that mask, she saw something else. Fear. Not for himself, but for her. Fear that the ritual would hurt her. Fear that it would break her. Fear that he would lose her before he ever truly had her. She gave him a small, trembling smile, trying to convey without words that she was strong enough, that she trusted him, that she was choosing this. He gave her a single sharp nod. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the water. It was hotter than she expected, a deep geothermal heat that was almost scalding. But it quickly became a comforting liquid embrace. She waded to the center of the pool, the water coming up to her shoulders. The moon was reflected on the surface, shattering into 1,000 silver shards around her. Ulfric moved to the edge of the spring, kneeling on one of the carved stones. He began to remove his clothing, piece by piece, and Astrid's breath caught in her throat. She had seen him bare-chested before, but now, in the moonlight with the ancient runes glowing faintly around them, he looked like a god carved from stone and shadow. His body was a map of scars, each one a story of survival. His muscles were thick and powerful, built from years of hard living in the wilderness. And between his legs... She looked away quickly, heat flooding her face that had nothing to do with the temperature of the water. He stepped into the spring, and the water rose around his waist. He moved towards her, each step deliberate, and when he was close enough to touch, he held his hands out, palms down, just above the surface of the water. "Close your eyes," he commanded, his voice taking on a new resonance, a rhythmic chanting quality. "Find the echo inside you, the last thread that connects you to him. Do not fear it. Look at it. Know it. You must be the one to offer it up." Astrid closed her eyes. She turned her focus inward, past the fear, past the pain, into the hollow void in her chest. And there it was, not a silver thread as it had once been, but a thin, ugly, blackened strand, a dead thing still latched onto her soul. It pulsed with a faint, resentful energy. Havard's pride, his anger, his possessiveness. "I see it," she breathed, the steam swirling around her face. "Good, now let it go." He plunged his hands into the water, pain, it was absolute. A searing white-hot agony erupted from the center of her chest, a supernova of torment. It was not the slow burn of heartbreak. It was the brutal, violent tearing of a soul. She screamed, a raw animal sound that was ripped from her throat. The blackened thread was being cauterized, burned away with a fire that felt like it was consuming her from the inside out. Her body arched in the water, every muscle seizing. She felt herself dissolving, becoming nothing but the pain, the silver moonlight and the searing heat. Then, through the fire came the ice. From where Ulfric's hands entered the water, a wave of profound elemental cold spread through the spring. It was not the cold of winter, but the cold of the void between stars, the absolute zero of a soul that had been alone for centuries. It slammed into the fire, a cataclysmic battle inside her. She was being torn apart and frozen solid all at once. The pain was unbearable. She was losing herself, her consciousness fragmenting. "Anchor," his voice echoed in her mind, not through her ears, but directly into her soul. "Hold fast." She felt a new energy flow from him through the water into her. It was the strength of the mountains, the ancient resilience of the stone, the deep, unshakable power of the Thornwood itself. It was him, his essence. It wrapped around her fragmented spirit, a steadying, grounding force. It did not stop the pain, but it gave her something to cling to in the storm. It was the anchor. She focused on it, on him, on the scent of winter and iron, on the memory of his gentle hands tending her ankle, on the deep sorrow and unwavering strength in his one good eye, on the feel of his lips against hers. She clung to the thought of him as the fire and ice ripped the last vestiges of Havard's echo from her soul. And then, with a final violent wrench, the blackened thread snapped. Release was explosive. A wave of energy erupted from her, turning the water of the spring into a frenzy, sending steam billowing into the air. The pain vanished, replaced by a vast, silent emptiness. But this emptiness was different. It was not the cold, dead hollow of before. It was clean, pure, a blank slate. She slumped forward in the water, utterly spent, her head falling beneath the surface. Strong hands caught her before she could drown. Ulfric was there, his arms around her, lifting her up. She surfaced with a gasp, water streaming down her face, her body trembling violently. "It is done," he rasped, his voice strained. The ritual had taken a toll on him as well. She could feel a fine tremor running through his powerful body, but it wasn't done. Not yet. A new thread was spinning itself into existence in the clean space inside her. It was not the frivolous, shining silver of her first bond. This one was different. It was woven of deep earth and cold stone, of iron resilience and shared solitude. It grew from her chest and reached out, seeking, searching, and then it found him. The moment the new bond snapped into place, connecting her soul to Ulfric's, Astrid cried out. But this was not a cry of pain. It was something else entirely. The bond was alive, vibrant, thrumming with power. And through it she could feel him. She could feel his strength, his fierce protectiveness, his bone-deep loneliness. She could feel the curse that haunted him, a dark presence at the edge of his consciousness, always there, always whispering. But she could also feel his wonder, his awe, his desperate hope that she was real, that this wasn't a dream. And underneath it all, she felt his desire. Raw, primal, barely restrained. He wanted her with an intensity that stole her breath away. Her eyes flew open, meeting his gaze. His gray eye was blazing, reflecting the moonlight like liquid silver. And for the first time, a new scent began to rise from her skin, faint but clear in the cold night air. The scent of winter jasmine, a flower that bloomed against all odds in the deepest snow. The scent of her own soul reawakening. Ulfric's nostrils flared as he caught the scent, and a look of such fierce satisfaction crossed his face that it made her wolf whine with need. "Mine," he growled, the word acclaiming a vow. "Yours," she breathed, and it was permission, acceptance, surrender. His mouth came down on hers, and this kiss was different from the one in the cave. This was not tentative or questioning. This was absolute possession. His tongue swept into her mouth, tasting her, claiming her. His hands roamed her body, one tangling in her wet hair, the other sliding down her back to cup her rear, pulling her flush against him. She could feel every hard inch of him through the thin, wet fabric of her shift, and the sensation made her moan into his mouth. The bond between them flared hot and bright, amplifying every touch, every sensation. She could feel his pleasure as if it were her own, a feedback loop of desire that threatened to consume them both. "Ulfric," she gasped as his lips left hers to trail down her neck. "Please, tell me what you need," he demanded, his voice rough, his breath hot against her skin. "Tell me, she-wolf." "You," she said, her hands sliding up his chest, feeling the hard planes of muscle, the ridges of scars. "I need you, all of you." Something broke in him then. With a low growl, he lifted her, her legs wrapping automatically around his waist. He carried her through the water to the edge of the pool, where a smooth, flat stone had been warmed by the heat of the spring. He laid her down on it, the warm stone a stark contrast to the cold air. He loomed over her, his massive frame blocking out the moon, his face shadowed but his eye burning with barely restrained hunger. "Once I start," he said, his voice shaking with the effort of control, "I will not be able to stop. I will claim you, Astrid, body and soul. The bond will demand it. Do you understand?" "Yes," she said, reaching up to cup his scarred face, pulling him down to her. "I understand, and I want it. I want you to claim me." The last thread of his control snapped. His hands were everywhere, tearing at the wet shift that clung to her body, ripping the fabric away until she was bare beneath him. The cold air hit her heated skin, but before she could shiver, his body was covering hers, his warmth enveloping her. His mouth found her breast, his tongue swirling around the peaked nipple before he took it into his mouth, sucking hard. The sensation shot straight to her core, and she arched beneath him, a cry escaping her lips. Through the bond, she could feel his satisfaction, his pleasure at her response, and it only heightened her own. His hands explored every inch of her, rough and calloused but incredibly skilled, finding every sensitive spot, every place that made her gasp and moan. He mapped her body like a territory to be conquered, claimed, possessed. And she let him, surrendering to the overwhelming sensation, to the pleasure that built higher and higher with each touch. When his fingers finally found the heat between her legs, she nearly came undone. He groaned at the feel of her, wet and ready, and began to stroke her with a skill that suggested he was far more experienced than his isolation would suggest. Or perhaps it was the bond, allowing him to feel what she felt, to know exactly what she needed. So beautiful, he murmured against her skin, his fingers working magic. So perfect, mine. Yours, she gasped, her hips moving against his hand, seeking more friction, more pressure. Ulfric, please, I know what you need, he said, and there was a dark promise in his voice. He positioned himself between her thighs, his arousal pressing against her entrance. He was large, intimidatingly so, and for a moment fear flickered through her. He felt it through the bond and paused, his eye meeting hers. I will be careful, he promised, his voice gentler. I will never hurt you, not like he did. She believed him. Through the bond, she could feel his sincerity, his determination to make this good for her, to show her what it should have been like all along. I trust you, she whispered, and it was the truth. He entered her slowly, carefully, giving her body time to adjust to his size. The stretch was intense, almost painful but not unpleasant. And with every inch he claimed, the bond between them flared brighter, stronger, until it felt like a living thing, a third presence in their joining. When he was fully seated inside her, they both stilled, breathing hard, overwhelmed by the sensation. Astrid had never felt so full, so complete. It was as if a missing piece of herself had finally clicked into place. Ulfric's forehead pressed against hers, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Astrid, he groaned, her name a prayer, a plea. My she-wolf, my mate. Word mate sent a shiver through her. Not the cold, political mate she had been to Havard, but a true mate, a partner, an equal. Move, she begged, her nails digging into his shoulders. Please, Ulfric, move. He did, pulling out slowly before thrusting back in, setting a rhythm that was both tender and fierce. Each movement sent waves of pleasure through her body, amplified by the bond until she couldn't tell where she ended and he began. They moved together like they had done this 1,000 times before, their bodies in perfect sync, as if the bond had given them instinctive knowledge of each other's needs. The pleasure built higher and higher, a tightening coil in her core. Ulfric's movements became more urgent, more desperate, his control fraying at the edges. His hand slid between their bodies, finding the sensitive bundle of nerves at her apex, and with a few skilled strokes, he sent her hurtling over the edge. She came apart beneath him, her body convulsing with the force of her release, his name a scream on her lips. The bond between them exploded with light and sensation, and she felt his own climax through it, felt the moment he spilled inside her with a roar that echoed through the clearing. They collapsed together, tangled in each other's arms, breathing hard, their hearts beating in unison. The water of the spring lapped gently at the edge of the stone, the moon still shone overhead, and the ancient runes pulsed with a satisfied glow, as if the magic itself was pleased with what had been wrought here. The ritual was complete. The bond was forged. Not just an anchor, but something far more profound. A true mate bond, born of choice and passion and mutual respect. Astrid's wolf, silent for so long, finally lifted its head and howled, a sound of joy and recognition. And deep in the forest, she heard an answering howl, not from Ulfric's throat, but from his wolf, claiming her, celebrating her, welcoming her home. The world after the ritual was sharper, clearer, as if a film had been wiped from her eyes. The bond with Ulfric was a quiet, steady presence within her, but also a raging inferno of connection. It was not the distant, fatting thing her bond with Havard had become. This was immediate, visceral, alive. She could feel him always now, even when they were apart. She knew when he was hunting, when he was patrolling the borders, when he was simply standing in the cave watching her sleep with a mixture of wonder and fierce protectiveness. And he could feel her too, her emotions, her needs, her slowly healing heart. Her senses, so long muted, were fully reawakened. When Ulfric left the cave now, she could follow his movements through the bond, feeling the direction he took, the creatures he passed, the very trees he touched. She could smell the subtle shift in the air that heralded a coming snow and hear the distant snap of a twig under a deer's hoof from hundreds of yards away. And her own scent, the winter jasmine, grew stronger each day. It was a quiet declaration of her own returning identity, of her wolf fully awakened and thriving. Her inner wolf was no longer a silent ghost, but a vibrant presence, watchful and calm, watching the scarred alpha with profound respect and growing affection. The change in Ulfric was more subtle, but it was there. The profound loneliness that had clung to him like a shroud had lifted. The deep well of sorrow was still present, a grief for his lost pack that she knew might never fade, but it was no longer an all-consuming void. There was light in him now, warmth, hope. Sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, she would catch him watching her with an expression of such tender disbelief that it made her heart ache. The pact had been for solace, a light in his long night. And she was fulfilling her part, but she was also receiving far more than she'd bargained for. They fell into a new routine, one of shared purpose and growing intimacy. She was no longer a patient, a refugee. She was a partner in their shared isolation, and more, she was his mate. She learned to set snares, to track game in the snow, to identify the edible roots and barks that sustained them. Her body grew stronger, leaner, the soft edges of her life as a pampered queen replaced by the hard-earned resilience of a survivor. But it wasn't all work and survival. There were moments of joy, of playfulness, of a kind of domestic happiness she'd never known in Havard's palace. Ulfric would return from a hunt, and instead of simply presenting his kill, he would sweep her into his arms and spin her around, burying his face in her hair and breathing in her scent as if it were a lifeline. They would lie together by the fire, her back against his broad chest, his arms wrapped around her, and he would tell her stories of his pack, of the great hunts and the fierce battles, of the laughter and love that had once filled these woods. And she would mourn with him for what he'd lost, while also celebrating what they were building together. The physical side of their bond remained intense. The attraction between them never faded, never became routine. Some nights he would take her with a desperate urgency, as if afraid she might disappear. Other times he would be achingly gentle, worshipping her body with his hands and mouth until she was trembling and begging. And sometimes she would take control, pushing him onto his back and riding him until they were both gasping and spent. The bond amplified everything, making each touch, each kiss, each joining an experience that transcended the physical. They were truly one flesh, one soul, two halves of a whole that had finally found each other. But their peace was not to last. One afternoon, a week after the ritual, Ulfric returned to the cave, not with game, but with a grim set to his jaw and rage simmering through the bond. The pressure at the edge of his territory, the one she had almost grown used to, had changed. Grimthorn grows impatient, he said, his voice a low growl. He has sent a new party. They are probing the borders, testing the wards. They carry silver. Astrid's blood ran cold. Silver, not the metal of jewelers, but the bane of their kind. A weapon used not for hunting, but for war, for extermination. Havard was no longer just trying to reclaim his queen. He was preparing to invade, to punish the rogue who had sheltered her. "What will you do?" she asked, her own voice tight with fear, not for herself, but for him. "I will remind him why his father and his father's father taught their pups to fear the Thornwood," Ulfric said, his good eye glinting like polished steel. He went to a dark alcove at the back of the cave, a place she had never seen him approach. He pulled aside a heavy hide curtain revealing a chamber carved from the rock. Inside, hanging on the wall, was a set of ancient, formidable armor, plates of blackened steel etched with the same runes she'd seen at the spring. And leaning beside it was a weapon that made her gasp. It was a massive battle axe, its twin heads forged of dark, gleaming metal that seemed to drink the light. "This curse," he said, his hand resting on the axe's haft. "It took my pack, but it left me their strength. It is a debt I carry." He turned to her, his face a mask of grim resolve. "Stay in the cave. Bar the entrance. Do not leave until I return," Astrid said, stepping forward, through the bond. She sent him her determination, her refusal to hide while he fought her battles. "I will not cower here. I am your mate, Ulfric. I stand with you." His eye widened, and she felt a surge of emotion through the bond, pride mixed with fear, love tangled with protectiveness. "You are healed, but you are not yet ready for this kind of battle, she-wolf." "Then teach me," she said fiercely. "Or at least let me watch your back. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. He stared at her for a long moment, the internal battle clear on his face. Finally, he gave a short nod. "Very well, but you stay behind me, always. If I tell you to run, you run. Do you understand?" "I understand," she lied. If it came to that, if he was in true danger, she would not run. The bond would not allow it. She would fight beside him or die trying. He donned the armor piece by piece, and with each plate he strapped on, He became less the gentle male who held her at night and more the ancient warrior king he truly was. The armor fit him as if it were a second skin, and with the axe in his hand and the scarred, blackened armor covering his massive frame, he was no longer a reclusive exile. He was a figure from legend, a wraith of war and vengeance. He looked at her one last time, and through the bond, he sent her a wave of emotion so intense it brought tears to her eyes. Love, fierce and consuming. Gratitude for her presence, her strength. A vow to return to her, no matter the cost. Then he was gone, a phantom of iron and fury melting into the snow-dusted forest, and Astrid followed, keeping to the shadows, her newly awakened wolf guiding her steps. She stayed far enough back that he wouldn't sense her immediately through the bond, using what he'd taught her to mask her scent and move silently through the woods. She reached a high vantage point, a rocky outcropping that gave her a clear view of the forest below, and there at the edge of Ulfric's territory she saw them. Havard had not come himself, not yet, but he'd sent his best warriors, a dozen of them, all armed with silver weapons. Silver chains, silver-tipped arrows, silver blades. They moved with the coordinated precision of trained soldiers, probing the invisible barrier that marked the boundary of the Thornwood. And then Ulfric appeared. He didn't emerge from the trees. He simply materialized in the center of the group, as if the shadows themselves had birthed him. The warriors startled, weapons raising, but they were too slow. Ulfric moved with a speed and grace that belied his massive size. His axe was a blur of dark metal, and where it struck, warriors fell. But he wasn't killing them, she realized with surprise. He was disarming them, disabling them, sending them running back towards Havard's territory with broken limbs and shattered weapons. It was a message, a warning. This is my domain. You are not welcome here. But then something went wrong. One of the warriors, bolder or more foolish than the rest, didn't run. Instead, he raised his bow. A silver-tipped arrow knocked and aimed not at Ulfric, but past him. At the cave. At where he thought Astrid was hiding. "The Omega," the warrior shouted. "Kill the Omega and the rogue will fall." Time seemed to slow. Ulfric spun, his face contorted with rage and fear, but he was too far away. The warrior released the arrow, and it flew true, arcing through the air towards the cave entrance. But Astrid wasn't at the cave. She was on the outcropping, and she saw everything. Her wolf surged forward, and without thinking, she let it take control. The shift came easier than it ever had before, her body flowing from human to wolf in a heartbeat. And she was running, faster than she'd ever run, her paws finding purchase on the snow and stone, her newly awakened senses tracking the trajectory of the arrow. She burst from the tree line just as the arrow would have struck the cave entrance, and she leapt, her jaws closing around the shaft mid-flight, the force of it spinning her in the air. She landed hard, the impact driving the breath from her lungs, but she held on, the silver arrow clenched in her teeth. The forest went silent. Every warrior, every wolf, every creature within a mile radius seemed to freeze, because what Astrid had just done should have been impossible. Omega wolves were not fighters, not hunters. They were nurturers, healers. They did not have the speed or strength to catch arrows from the air, but Astrid was no ordinary Omega. She was bonded to the land itself, anchored to one of the most powerful alphas to ever live. The Thornwood had claimed her, just as Ulfric had, and it had given her gifts she was only beginning to understand. She dropped the arrow and shifted back to human form, standing naked in the snow, her body steaming in the cold air, her eyes blazing with fury. "You want to kill me," she said, her voice carrying across the clearing. "Then face me, not from a distance with a coward's weapon, but face to face. Or are you too afraid?" The warrior who had shot the arrow stared at her, his face pale. He took a step back, then another, and then he was running, crashing through the undergrowth in his haste to escape. The remaining warriors followed, their morale broken. They had come to fight a rogue alpha and terrify a broken Omega. They had not expected to find a unified force, a mated pair bonded by magic far older and more powerful than anything they understood. When the last of them had fled, Astrid's legs gave out, the adrenaline draining from her body. But before she hit the ground, strong arms caught her, lifting her against a broad chest. Ulfric held her, his armor cold against her bare skin, his body shaking with a complex storm of emotions. Fear for what could have happened. Pride in her strength and bravery. Fury at her for putting herself in danger. Love, overwhelming and absolute. "You followed me," he said, his voice rough. "I did," she admitted, too tired to lie. "You could have been killed. So could you." He pulled back to look at her, and she saw tears tracking down his scarred face. Do not ever do that again. Do you understand me? I cannot lose you. I cannot. She reached up and cupped his face, her thumb brushing away the tears. Then don't give me reason to fear for you. We are bonded, Ulfric. Where you go, I go. In battle and in peace. That is what it means to be mates. He closed his eye, a shudder running through him, and then he was kissing her, hard and desperate, pouring every ounce of his fear and love and gratitude into the meeting of their lips. When he finally pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers. You are going to be the death of me, she-wolf. Or the life of you, she corrected softly. He laughed, a broken, beautiful sound, and carried her back to the cave, where he spent the rest of the day showing her just how precious she was to him, how terrified he'd been, how much he needed her. And Astrid learned that night that the bond between them was not just about desire or survival or even love. It was about becoming something greater together than either of them could be alone. The confrontation came 3 days later. This time, Havard did not send his warriors. He came himself. They felt his approach through the territory, a single powerful presence burning with incandescent rage. But there was something else too, something that made Astrid's skin crawl. A wrongness, a taint, as if Havard had touched something dark and forbidden in his quest for vengeance. He has made a bargain, Ulfric said grimly, standing at the cave entrance and staring into the forest. With the old darkness I mentioned, he has given himself over to it in exchange for power. What kind of power? Astrid asked, fear coiling in her gut. Kind that corrupts, Ulfric said. The kind that destroys everything it touches. He turned to her, his face grave. This will not be like the last fight, Astrid. He will not be satisfied with a defeat. He will want blood, my blood. And if he can't have that, he will settle for destroying everything I hold dear. She understood what he was saying. Havard would target her, use her to hurt Ulfric. It was what he'd always done, weaponized those around him to maintain control. Then we face him together, she said. And we end this. You have a plan, he said, reading her expression, feeling her determination through the bond. I do, she said. But you're not going to like it. They met him in the ashen clearing just as they had with the warriors. But this time the clearing looked different. The great lightning-blasted oak had tiny buds of green on its branches, the first signs of life in decades. The ash on the ground had thinned, revealing dark, rich soil beneath. The curse was lifting, broken by the presence of a true bond, by love and partnership where before there had been only death and isolation. Havard stood on the far side of the clearing, and Astrid barely recognized him. He was still handsome, still physically powerful. But there was something wrong about him. His eyes, once the color of a stormy sea, now held a sickly yellow glow. His scent, once pine and ozone, now carried an underlying rot. He had indeed made a dark bargain, and it was consuming him from the inside. So the ghost of the Thornwood lives, Havard snarled, his voice distorted, layered with something inhuman. Hiding in the shadows, stealing what is not his. Was never yours to own, Ulfric replied, his voice calm but carrying a weight of absolute authority. You discarded her. You broke the bond. She is under my protection now. She is my mate. Havard's gaze flicked to Astrid, standing just behind Ulfric's shoulder. His eyes widened as he took in her scent, the winter jasmine, the clear, undeniable scent of a fully awakened wolf. And then he must have felt it. The absolute total absence of her in the space where their bond had once been, replaced by something new, something infinitely stronger. The reality of it, the finality seemed to enrage him beyond reason. You dare, he roared, his form beginning to shimmer and distort. You dare anchor yourself to this creature, this walking corpse. But before he could shift, Astrid stepped forward, moving past Ulfric's protective bulk to stand in the open. Havard, she said, and her voice was steady, clear, carrying across the clearing with authority she'd never possessed as his queen. This ends now, not with blood, not with death, but with truth. She felt Ulfric's confusion through the bond, but also his trust. He didn't interfere, didn't pull her back, even though every instinct in him screamed to protect her. You blamed me for being barren, she continued, taking another step forward. You shamed me, humiliated me, cast me aside for another. But the truth is, Havard, it was never me, it was never my failing. She paused, letting her next words sink in. It was yours. Havard's face contorted with rage. Lies, Scene carries my child even now. Does she? Astrid asked softly. Or does she carry the child of one of your warriors, when you've been too proud and too blind to see? The words hung in the air like a blade. Astrid had suspected it for a while, had pieced together the timeline. the way Scene had looked at one of Havard's closest guards, the way Havard had been so quick to believe the child was his without waiting for proper confirmation. Through the bond, she felt Ulfric's sharp inhalation as he understood what she was doing. She was not just defending herself. She was revealing the rot at the heart of Havard's pack, the lies and deceptions that had eaten away at him long before he'd betrayed her. "You are lying," Havard said, but his voice lacked conviction, and the sickly yellow glow in his eyes flickered. "Am I?" Astrid challenged. "Deep down, you know the truth. Your bloodline is weakening, Havard, not because of me, but because you are unworthy to carry it forward. You have betrayed the old ways, forgotten what it means to be a true alpha. You rule through fear and politics, not through honor and strength." She took another step, close enough now that she could see the tremor in his hands, the cracks forming in the dark power he'd claimed. "And in your desperation, you made a bargain with something you don't understand, something that is consuming you even as we speak." Havard looked down at his hands, and for the first time seemed to see the black veins spreading beneath his skin, the physical manifestation of the corruption he'd invited into himself. "Darkness you've embraced," Astrid continued, her voice gentler now, almost pitying. "It whispered promises of power, of vengeance, of everything you'd lost. But it lied. It always lies. And now it's too late. It has you." She stopped just a few feet from him, close enough to touch, and she saw the truth in his eyes. The man she'd once loved, however fleetingly, was gone. In his place was a puppet, strings pulled by something ancient and malevolent. "But there is one chance," she said. "One way to break its hold. You must choose, Havard. Choose to let go. Let go of your pride, your rage, your obsession. Let go of me, truly let go." For a moment, just a heartbeat, she saw a flicker of the man he'd once been. A young alpha who had dreamed of a great pack, of a strong legacy. A man who had loved her in his own flawed way before ambition and pride had corrupted him. I can't," he whispered, and it was a confession, an admission of his own weakness. "Then I release you," Astrid said. And she meant it. She'd been holding on to anger, onto hurt, onto the need for vindication. But standing here, seeing what he'd become, she realized that her greatest weapon was not revenge, but mercy. Forgiveness. She placed her hand over his heart, and through the bond with Ulfric, she called upon the magic of the Thornwood, the ancient power that flowed through the earth and stone. Light erupted from her palm, clean and pure, the opposite of the dark corruption that had taken root in Havard. It spread through his body, burning away the black veins, the sickly yellow glow. He screamed, but it was not a scream of pain. It was a scream of release, of something foul and hateful being ripped away. When the light faded, Havard collapsed to his knees in the ash. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. The dark power was gone, but so was much of the strength he'd built his life upon. He was just a man now, an alpha stripped of his inflated pride and forced to confront his own failures. He looked up at Astrid with clear eyes, no longer consumed by rage or corruption, and she saw understanding dawn. "You could have destroyed me," he said, his voice hoarse. "Why didn't you?" "Because I am not you," she said simply. "And because the bond I share with Ulfric has taught me that true strength is not found in dominance or revenge. It's found in choosing mercy when you have the power to destroy." She stepped back, returning to Ulfric's side, where he immediately wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. Through the bond, she felt his fierce pride, his overwhelming love, his awe at what she'd just done. Havard slowly got to his feet. He looked at them, at the clearing with its budding oak tree and fertile soil, at the obvious bond that connected them, and for the first time, true remorse crossed his face. "I was a fool," he said quietly. "I had something precious, and I threw it away for pride and ambition, and in doing so, I nearly destroyed myself." He bowed his head, a gesture of respect, of surrender. "I will leave, and I will not return. The Thornwood is yours, she is yours, and I will try to be better." He shifted then, his form flowing into that of his wolf, and he turned and ran, disappearing into the forest without looking back. Astrid sagged against Ulfric, suddenly exhausted. The magic she'd called upon had drained her, but it had been worth it. The threat was gone, not through violence, but through truth and mercy. "You never cease to amaze me," Ulfric murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "My brilliant, fierce, merciful she-wolf. I learned from the best," she said, tilting her face up for a proper kiss. As their lips met, the bond between them flared bright and warm, and all around the clearing, new growth began to push through the ash. Flowers bloomed, small and delicate but resilient. The curse was truly broken now, not by death or violence, but by the power of a bond forged in choice and strengthened by love. The Thornwood was healing. And so were they. 5 years later, 5 winters had passed over the Thornwood. 5 cycles of deep snow and silent starlit nights. But the forest was no longer silent or dead. Life had returned in abundance. The borders of Ulfric's territory were respected now, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Word had spread through the mountain packs of the Ghost King who had returned from death, and of his mate, the Winter Queen, who had broken a curse with mercy and love. Other exiles, other broken wolves, began to find their way to the Thornwood, seeking sanctuary, and Ulfric and Astrid welcomed them. What had started as a refuge for 2 lonely souls had become something more. A new pack, built not on politics or bloodlines, but on the old ways. On respect and honor, on strength tempered by compassion, on the understanding that every wolf deserved a place to belong. The cave had been expanded, carved deeper into the mountain, with chambers for those who chose to stay, for families who needed shelter, for the healers and teachers and warriors who pledged their loyalty not to a crown, but to a shared ideal. Astrid stood at the entrance to their home, now more a fortress than a cave, a heavy fur cloak wrapped around her shoulders despite the warmth of the summer air. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, feeling the strong kicks of the life growing within. She had been wrong about being barren. Or rather, Havard had been wrong. Because here, anchored to Ulfric, bonded to the land itself, her body had healed. Her womb had quickened. And in 2 moons' time she would give birth to the first new life born in the Thornwood in decades. "Are you well?" She turned to see Ulfric approaching, his massive frame somehow even more imposing now that he carried the weight of leadership again. But his face, when he looked at her, was soft, filled with such tender love that it still made her breath catch after all these years. "I'm perfect," she said, and it was the truth. He came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her, his hands covering hers on her belly. Their child kicked against his palm, and she felt his sharp intake of breath, his wonder through the bond. "He's strong," Ulfric murmured. "Like his mother." "Or she is strong like her father," Astrid countered with a smile. They didn't know yet whether the child would be a boy or girl, and they didn't care. Boy or girl, this child would be loved, would be raised in a pack that valued them for who they were, not what others expected them to be. "Have news," Ulfric said, his tone becoming more serious. "A messenger came from the south, from Grimthorn's territory." Astrid stiffened slightly, old fears trying to resurface. But Ulfric's arms tightened around her, grounding her. "He seeks an audience. He wants to formally apologize, to ask for an alliance between our packs." She turned in his arms to look at him. "What did you tell the messenger?" "That it was not my decision alone to make," Ulfric said. "That this pack is led by both of us, and that you have as much right to accept or refuse as I do." Her heart swelled with love for him. Even now, after 5 years, after building a thriving pack, after countless nights of passion and days of partnership, he still surprised her with his respect, his consideration. "I think," she said slowly, "that we should hear him out. Not because we owe him anything, but because mercy was the weapon that broke the curse. And perhaps extending that mercy one more time will help heal old wounds." Ulfric nodded. "Then we will meet with him, together." "Together," she agreed. They stood like that for a long moment, watching the sun set over the Thornwood, painting the trees in shades of gold and amber. The forest hummed with life, with the laughter of pack members, with the howls of wolves running free, with the promise of a future bright and boundless. "Never thought I could have this," Astrid said softly. "A true home, a real family, a mate who sees me as an equal. I never thought I could be anything other than a cursed exile, haunting a dead forest," Ulfric replied. "But you changed everything. You brought life back to this place. You brought life back to me." She turned in his arms and kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. And through the bond, she felt his answering devotion, his fierce protectiveness, his absolute commitment to her and their growing family. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, she smiled up at him. "We should go inside. The pack is gathering for the evening meal, and you know how they get if we're late." He laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Let them wait. I want one more moment, just the 2 of us, before we face our responsibilities." So they stood together in the fading light, 2 broken souls who had found each other in the darkest of places and built something beautiful from the ashes. The Ghost King and the Winter Queen, mates and partners, leading a pack that would become legend. And in the distance, barely audible, the Thornwood itself seemed to sigh with contentment, the ancient magic satisfied at last. The curse was not just broken, but transformed, turned from a prison into a sanctuary, from death into life, from darkness into light. All because two souls had chosen each other, had chosen to be better, had chosen love over hate, mercy over vengeance, partnership over power. The Thornwood had found its rulers, and they had found their home.